Hey Indian Creek 8th grade students, this is Professor Blazek and I would like to welcome you to part 4 of our video series on the American Civil War, looking at early battles. Now the guiding question that I would like you to keep in mind as you watch this video is, what was the main goal of the Union troops who were fighting in the West, and why did the Union experience early trouble in the East? Now, the first main battle of the Civil War took place at Bull Run, Virginia on July 21st, 1861. And in this first battle of Bull Run, the Union originally drove their Confederate opponents back and appeared to be on their way to victory, but Confederate General Thomas Stonewall Jackson would eventually rally his troops to defeating their northern counterparts. These rebel soldiers would use what was called the rebel yell, which was a strange, unearthly, violent scream as they charged that would actually shock their northern opponents into a retreat. Now, this battle would serve to build the legend of General Stonewall Jackson as one of, if not the best, military leaders in the South, who would be involved in a number of other important battles early in the Civil War. In addition, this Southern victory sent shockwaves through the North because remember, the North had the larger army, stronger economy, more money than the South, and it was really a major blow for the North to lose this first major battle. And as a result, President Lincoln would call for many more troops to come and serve in the Union Army. Now, it's also important to look at the battles and events that were happening at sea during this time period because this is when the North would begin its blockade of southern ports. And remember that this was one of the major military goals of the North at the start of the war. Now, originally there were not enough ships to cover the entirety of the Confederate coast, but the North would continue throughout the war to build and send ships south until they had created a blockade similar to the one that is depicted in the map in the upper right corner of this slide. And this was called the Anaconda Plan because the North was hoping to build enough ships and create a long and winding enough blockade that it would eventually look like the body of a snake. Now, what this blockade would do is it would prevent the export of cotton, tobacco, other agricultural products that the South's economy was really built upon. And this would also prevent the import of money and supplies by the South, which created a major reduction in trade. And this trade reduction just served to magnify the disadvantages that the South already had. Remember, the South already had the weaker economy, less money, and losing the ability to trade their major crops was just one more obstacle that the South would have to try and overcome throughout the Civil War. Now, fighting was also taking place along the Tennessee River early in the Civil War, and the original site of a couple of attacks was launched from Cairo, Illinois on February 6, 1862. Cairo is right down about the most southern point of Illinois. And from Cairo, General Ulysses S. Grant, who would be a future U.S. president, would lead his Union forces into Tennessee and gain victory at both Fort Henry and Fort Donelson. Now, winning these battles would allow the North to gain control of the lower Tennessee River, which was another important waterway that would feed into the Mississippi River. And this also gave the Union a path to attack the Confederacy from the west. So this would allow the Union to use their numbers advantage to attack the South on multiple fronts. And these victories would also drive the South out of Kentucky, which, remember, Kentucky was one of those border states that the Union really could not afford to lose. But by gaining victory at Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, the North was able to create a buffer between the southern lines and the Kentucky border. So, important victories for a couple of different reasons for the North. Now, right around the same time period, the Battle of Shiloh took place in Hardin County, Tennessee. And at this battle, rebel troops would attack President Grant and his forces as they were moving south through Tennessee and toward Mississippi. And sort of the reverse of the Battle of Bull Run, the South originally pushed the North back and appeared as though they were going to be victorious. But on the second day of fighting, the North was able to gain an advantage and eventually move on to victory. And this would allow the Union to continue moving south and enter into Mississippi, and would also give the Union a road to move west and conquer Memphis, which was another important city in Tennessee. And then one final battle that is connected early on in the Civil War to these others took place in New Orleans, Louisiana on April 25th, 1862. And in this battle, the much stronger, much larger Union Navy would capture New Orleans, which was the South's largest city. And this would give the Union control the mouth of the Mississippi River, which is where the river flows into the Gulf of Mexico. And this gave the Union almost complete control of the waterway. And remember, the Mississippi River is the largest river in the country in terms of discharge. Very important waterway, and again, one of the main goals of the North was to control it from the start of the war. So these three victories would all combine in a very important way to the Union overall. Now, after these victories at Fort Henry, Fort Donelson, Shiloh, and New Orleans, this gave the North almost complete control of the Mississippi River, which, as I mentioned, was one of their three original goals in aiming to win the Civil War. So early on in the war in the West, the North was finding a large amount of success in achieving exactly what they set out to achieve. Now, in looking at the map, you can see Cairo labeled at the very most southern point of Illinois. This is where Grant and his troops would begin their movements, and they would go down into Fort Henry and Fort Donelson and find victory, continue moving south through Tennessee and gain victory at Shiloh. This allowed troops to move west to Memphis, conquer that city, and combined with the victory at New Orleans, you can see that this really created a wall for the Union, blocking off the entire Mississippi River. Just a visual representation of how the North was able to achieve one of its main goals from the outset of the war. Now, comparatively, things were not going nearly as well in the East, and this was mainly due to Union General George McClellan. Now, McClellan, who is pictured there at the right, was in control of the Army of the Potomac, which was the name of the army of the Union in the East, and he was very, very cautious when he led his troops into battle. He would use reports that greatly overestimated the size of his opponents, and he would begin to doubt his troops' ability. But after being given time to train and work with his men, by March of 1862, he was ready to begin his goal, which was to capture the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia. We're going to see that this was not really going to be the case. Now, what McClellan did instead of moving his army by land is he would move his men by ship toward Richmond from southeast of the city, but this took far, far too long, and his chances to attack would begin to slip away, again, because he was just being far too overly cautious. Now, President Lincoln would try and get McClellan to fight, but McClellan just refused to budge, and the more time that he took was more time for the South to continue to strengthen their defense and their numbers of men at Richmond. Now, this would lead to a series of battles called the 7 Days Battles, which took place southeast of Richmond from June 25th to July 1st of 1862. And in these 7 days battles, General McClellan's continued hesitations would allow the Confederates and Robert E. Lee, who is pictured there at the right, the time to drive the North back from Richmond. Again, because McClellan was so laggard in his decision making, in taking any sort of initiative or action. He just kept playing into Robert E. Lee and the Confederates' hands, giving them more and more time to regroup and continue fighting until the South had won these 7 days battles and the Union troops under McClellan had been driven back from Richmond. Now, as another way of attacking Richmond, the North initiated the Second Battle of Bull Run in the same site as the first battle on August 29th, 1862. But in this battle, Union General John Pope's troops were ultimately driven back by the Confederate armies under Stonewall Jackson and Robert E. Lee, and this would remove any final threat to Richmond. So the North had failed in both of its major pushes into conquering the Southern capital, and not only that, but now the South's armies had moved to a point where the Union capital of Washington, D.C. was now in danger. So just some major failures by the Union Army in these battles on the eastern side of the war. Now, General McClellan would make one final major mistake when he and his troops were following Robert E. Lee and the Confederates north into Maryland. And McClellan's soldiers would actually find a copy of Lee's battle orders, which gave them a huge advantage because they knew exactly what Lee and the Confederates were going to do. But McClellan being McClellan, he was again overly cautious and gave Lee and the Confederates enough time to regroup and mount an effective defense in the next battle. And this battle would be the Battle of Antietam, which took place at Antietam Creek in Maryland on September 17th of 1862. Now, Antietam would actually be the bloodiest battle in the entire war, and neither side would be the clear victors. At the end of the battle, the Southern troops under Robert E. Lee would retreat back into Virginia, so history books and certain people may claim that this was a Northern victory, but on the flip side, General McClellan would not follow President Lincoln's orders to track Lee down into Virginia and just wipe out Lee's forces after this battle. So Southern troops did retreat south out of Maryland after Antietam, but at the same time, the North and McClellan missed out on another major opportunity to strike an important victory for the North. So at this point, Lincoln had finally had enough and would replace McClellan as the head of the Army of the Potomac, ending a pretty bad regime that was marked by continued hesitations and failure to gain important victories by McClellan. So if you look at the map here, you can see some of the battles that we had just talked about. You can see the site of Antietam, the 7 days battles, and the Second Battle of Bull Run. And so you can see that the South was beginning to progress into the North, and the North would eventually force them back after Antietam. But for the most part, during this time period, the North was not able to make any major inroads into conquering any land in the South. They were consistently repelled, again, because of some poor leadership and lack of initiative by their generals. So we will end the video once more on the guiding question, and I will see you next time for part 5 in our video series on the American Civil War. And until then, this has been Professor Blazek, signing off.